The next talk is entitled Healing the Past. And to talk about how communities come to terms with loss, please welcome to the stage Michael Mansfield QC, Lucy Ash, Tim Phillips, and asking the questions is John Kampfner.
Thank you very much. I'm neither Oscar nor am I Alan Little. But as the person who runs the UK Creative Industries Federation, I think it's really, really interesting to look at the whole question, and we'll be talking Brexit and other stuff tomorrow, but let's keep our sights higher for the moment. We'll be looking at the whole question of how do you deal with, we were talking in the yurt earlier with Tim and with Oscar, some of you may have been there, the whole question of peacemaking, which is a subject obviously very close to Mark's mind and the whole ethos of Beyond Borders this year and every year, and with Michael and the amazing work that he has done with Hillsborough and many other issues besides. Lucy, who's a documentary maker for the BBC, who has covered many war and immediate post-war situations from Chechnya to many other places besides. She's just come back from Colombia and elsewhere. And Tim and his Beyond Conflict whole body of work. And Tim, I just thought to start with you. And just to continue a little bit, fleshing out the discussion we had a couple of hours ago in the year. What is it that can produce the impulse to move away from trauma, to work with trauma, and to seek reconciliation? From a sort of psychological point of view, how does a society or a party to a conflict move from one mindset to the other? What is the transition point?
Well, thank you. I have to say, seeing this mic makes me think I'm with the Wolf Tones, and I should have a little instrument playing. I was thinking about your question, John, a little bit earlier, and I want to mention a quote that was given to me by a very distinguished, retired, he's a combination of neuroscientist, anthropologist, and ad executive in the United States. And about 6 years ago, I was teaching a course at a university in the States on conflict transformation in the 21st century, the human dimension. Because if you study conflict resolution or negotiation or mediation, because it pretty much comes out of the social sciences, they talk about process, which is important, negotiation, getting to yes, a lot of things that seem very like, okay, this is the key to getting success, whether you're mediating between a family, a business, or an international conflict. And I would have speakers come in from different countries, and they would say things like, you cannot make peace with a humiliated partner. And they'd talk about empathy. Or one close friend from Guatemala said, exclusion is the main driver of conflict. And he was being a retired neuroscientist who then went into advertising. He was very glib. And he said to me, you know, there's a lot of brain science behind this. And I said, what do you mean? He said, let me put it this way. We are not rational beings with emotions. At our core, we are emotionally based beings who can only think rationally when we feel that our identities are understood by others. And understood and valued by others. And I just had one of those aha moments because it just sort of cascaded every experience I've had in this work for 30 years in 75 countries. And my own life experience. And I thought that's really quite profound. And there's now biology and science behind this. And I was mentioning earlier that, you know, which I think is going to be revolutionary, that scientists point out that it's more important to focus on how we think rather than what we think, because how we think is deeply unconscious with limited conscious access. And the reason I just want to mention that, John, is because here's what I've learned to answer your question. If you really want to understand about healing, and reconciliation. Too often the paradigm is a truth commission, transitional justice mechanisms, human rights requirements and structures. But we have to recognize what every single human being needs, particularly those who experienced conflict, repression, or trauma anywhere, is they need to be heard. They need to be acknowledged, not as you or I see them, but as they see themselves. That is the key that every human being requires, and I think it has to be central to any process of dealing with the past. Even before reconciliation is understanding.
If that's the case, and just to continue with you for a second, that we are emotional beings occasionally punctured by rationality, then in the peace and reconciliation and post-war scenario, do we have the structures?
We don't.
How do we deal with emotions and empathy through UN systems, through courts of law, through Hillsborough-style inquiries? How do we do it?
Well, I think for anybody here, I met somebody who's a graduate student in University of Edinburgh, and he came up to me and he said, I'm interested in studying. What do I study? I said, actually, you're coming along at the right time, because this entire field needs a paradigm shift. So let me just, as a way of answering your question, the MacArthur Foundation, it's really interesting, go online. They have put out a proposal, $100 million to, if you can convince them that you're going to solve, well, that was a signal out.
That would have been a potentially traumatic moment.
Yeah, yeah.
But anyway.
And he'll never forgive us.
Yeah.
And that is, solve a major global problem. And we've been asked to give one of the bids. And I said, here's the problem, is the way we think of the biggest social problems in the world is the problem. Because we're approaching them with two fundamental misconceptions about what shapes human behavior. One, that thanks to the Enlightenment, and I know the Scottish Enlightenment has a great tradition, but the Enlightenment got one fundamental thing wrong. The emerging field of science was not going to show that we're rational beings and superior to everything around us. It's actually science today that's showing not only are we mammals, but our unconscious brain shapes all our mental states. And therefore, the edifice of how we teach, train, human rights, conflict resolution, economics, political science are all built on a foundation that humans are rational beings. And in fact, we're not at our core. And the second thing is we walk around assuming that other people's behavior were conscious choices, when in fact, what science shows us is that most of those thought processes are unconscious with limited conscious access. So I think I was just in a meeting with the State Department in the White House. I was meeting with the head of the quartet to Palestine, and they're all asking the same questions. How do we weave these insights into some of the biggest challenges we face? Because nothing seems to be really working or
Well, at least it's reassuring that they're at least beginning to ask the questions, even if they're not coming the answers. Lucy, a lot of your journalism is very people-focused and documentary form rather than the sort of the wham-bam of immediate war coverage. Tell us some stories. I mean, you've just come back from Colombia, and as Oscar was pointing out earlier, and it's the number of people, displaced people through the decades of war with FARC outstrips the displacement of Syrians. It's extraordinary sort of sense of people movement. But talk us through any stories from Colombia or other natural disasters or others that you've been confronted with.
Yeah, as a preamble, I tend not to go to hot war zones. I go to them once they've kind of dropped out of the headlines and they've become tepid, maybe you could say. I mean, Colombia's had what they call a low-intensity war. It's not a phrase I like very much because it, in a way, belittles the horrible suffering that so many people have been through. But talking about what Tim was talking about, I did see this extraordinary experiment in a small theatre called Casa Ensemble in Bogota, where a soap opera actress, Alejandra Barrero, who used to be in all these popular soap operas like Coffee with the Scent of a Woman, that was a kind of, everybody had to watch it, cleared the streets. But she's now taken on this incredible project called Victus, where she's got people from all sides of the conflict. That means the FARC, the ELN, which is the smaller guerrilla group, the paramilitaries, the victims, and also people in the Colombian army. She's got them all together on stage to do a show. And a lot of people said, you're crazy, this is a recipe for disaster. How can these people even look at each other in the eye, let alone act together? And I focused on one woman who'd been a victim of horrendous paramilitary violence. She'd been trying to work with displaced families, and she'd spoken out about the way that young people, teenagers, are being abducted by the armed groups, and also about the extraordinary level of sexual violence by the armed groups against girls and women. And as a punishment, she was abducted, she was held hostage for 5 days in the jungle, she was raped by 5 men, she was tortured, left for dead at the side of the road. And she then had to go into a room in this theatre, and she had to leave her home like 6.9 million Colombians. She was driven away from where she lived in the Pacific region of Choco, and she had to move to the capital. And she'd been through all this, and she said, at the beginning, when I saw the paramilitaries, I could relate to the victims, the other families who'd lost children and husbands and brothers, but I couldn't deal with anyone in the armed conflict. I just couldn't face seeing them, and just when they stared at me, I felt like running out of the room. But then she did gradually, what you talk about, Tim, about acknowledging what other people have been through, acknowledging their suffering, validating their experience, it really proved very true in this, because then she started to see that, some of the people that were in the paramilitary themselves had been victims. They had been forced to join when they were kind of in their childhood or early teens. They'd had relatives that had been murdered in front of them, and all sorts of atrocities have been perpetrated against children in this war that's dragged on for half a century. And so she gradually began to connect with them. And they started off their show by going and hugging each member of the audience. And people sort of looked really, oh, what are they doing? And sort of got very nervous and embarrassed. But by the end, everybody was up on their feet cheering, and people had tears rolling down their face. And it does all sound a bit kumbaya. And how is this really going to help when vast chunks of the country are still completely lawless? And, despite the very good news about this historic peace treaty and all this amazing legal framework that's been put into place, there are just places where the law is a total irrelevance in Colombia. But I think that it's been a very, very instructive way of how people can connect with those that they perceived as their total enemies.
And in human terms, what happened when they had this initial sort of hug fest? I mean, beyond that, can you actually extend that to a more embedded peace and reconciliation? Does it actually work?
Well, that is the big question, but I think that all over the country there are networks of people who are trying to build some sort of peace, and the peace won't last. I mean, the main driver of it is this terrible inequality and the fact that lots of people don't have any land, or their land was taken away from them. And there are people that are striving very hard every day to try to bring sort of more sense of equity, and who are trying to mend the rifts that have grown up between people. But it's not an easy process, and it can easily be sent backwards by another act of violence. So it's very precarious, and I think it's something that is really worth striving for.
And not to speak of the fact the referendum hasn't even, that the peace signed last week hasn't even yet been ratified.
Yeah,
it may not even be so. So, Michael, just closer to home, when we're talking about, the first part of the question, how do human beings come to terms with loss? When it comes to Hillsborough and in the UK, it was loss compounded by humiliation and betrayal by the state of those individuals. Can you unpack those two? So you have the loss, which is the awful events of that day, and then you have the longer term sense of people not being with you. Talk us through those two aspects.
Yeah, surprisingly, is this working? Yes, that's fine. I'm not going to talk about Hillsborough. I'm going to talk about something that's been going on far longer than Hillsborough. It is involved in Hillsborough, but you tend to get refocused on something that's happened recently. but it's like the last talk. If you don't learn the lessons of history, you are sometimes bound to relive them. And the whole thing that through most of my career, I've been dealing with families who suffered huge loss. And one of the things that comes out of what we're saying now is, I've learned the hard way, you really do, first thing is you have to listen. You have to give people an opportunity to be heard so that you can listen to what it is they have to say. Now that's the first point, and it comes out of this discussion. And really I can go back through the cases and, you know, it's Hillsborough, Bloody Sunday, the Marchioness, Stephen Lawrence, and a whole load before that. They all have the same point. They all say the same thing. Nobody has listened. Nobody has wanted to listen because, of course, the truth that they want told is unacceptable at the point in time they want it told. So you have to move from being prepared to listen to what they want to say to establishing the truth. Now, it seems to me there's a sequence here. You listen to what they have to say, and it is a truth they want told. Then it's not going to be good enough just to listen. Because what's the other thing? That all these communities, right the way through, and I want to bring it right up to date, because with Yvette, my partner's in the front row here, we were in Belfast. I've done a lot of work in Ireland. Only the other week, 2 weekends ago. And what is shocking, and even I did not realize, the wall, it's called the Peace Wall, is still there. It's still as high as it ever was. And you say, well, wait a minute. Because walls are very, symbolic throughout the world. The wall in the occupied territories and all the rest of it. And what's happening in Belfast, what's the risk of happening is people either side of the wall still want it. They want it even more than they did before. Because the question about being heard and establishing the truth is a process that hasn't yet finished. And until it does, until the truth is established and people recognize, as the Hillsborough family, as the Stephen Lawrence and all, at last, somebody's not only listened, but actually we've established what we wanted to say in the first place. You move it on. There's a third stage. There's no point in having the truth unless, I know these are rather glib, but actually they're very important, because what do people really want? Not money. They want the truth and they want accountability. The one thing that, I call it our so-called democracy, has not delivered, may yet do so, but hasn't delivered. But what they find they get is a form of accountability. And I'm not saying it has to be an inquiry. I'm not saying it has to be a commission. I'm not saying it has to be an inquest. But there has to be a structure within which those first stages, the speaking, the listening, the truth, the establishment of the truth, and then accountability. And that was the whole point about the South African experience. Was it, in fact, it was asking people to establish the truth by a form of immunity if people were prepared to tell the truth, and if they weren't, they'd be prosecuted. And Bishop Tutu, who I've had discussions with him about exactly the same thing for Ireland and elsewhere, is that unless you get to the point at which you can, and this is what he was doing, introduce the perpetrators to the victims, and that they're willing to actually meet in the same room, and they're willing to embrace. And A Hard Day's Journey into Day, I don't know whether any of you have seen it, it's a wonderful film in which the whole process of the Truth Commission was filmed to show you what reconciliation can do. So these various stages are the unpacking, it seems to me. And until you get to that, and we got it in Hillsborough, that families, they haven't got accountability. And I met them only 2 days ago. They're saying, yeah, we've been listened to at last. And we've established a truth, and now we want accountability, we want justice. And until we get that, and of course that's the next stage. But these are processes, and you see people. And I have to say, it's the first time in my whole career, and there are other barristers here, I've been in a courtroom when a verdict comes back from a jury, they call it something else now, a narrative. The whole place erupted. And I thought, I've never had a standing ovation. But it wasn't about me. Of course it wasn't, or any of the lawyers. It was about the fact that they, the families, were saying to the jury sitting on the other side, humanity at last. And I've never seen the public, or the public families, actually converged across the courtroom and hugged each other.
On the question, on the final stage, accountability
Yeah.
and reconciliation, is it and, or is it an either or? Because you either have accountability and people being punished through law, and as we know in so many episodes of British non-accountability, that has not happened, or you have the reconciliation and the hugging experience, a lot of which depends upon impunity for a certain group of a certain number of people below a certain level, or at least some sort of mitigatory process. Can you get both?
Well, I think you can get both, and I think you should get both. So I think that where you have established...
You didn't get both in South Africa.
No, you didn't get both. I'm not saying that that's the ideal. In my head, what I'm saying, I can see the possibility of not a prosecuting authority saying, oh, well, we won't prosecute someone because it's too old, or they're too old, or whatever the reasons are, the public interest and so on. No, sorry. If there's been an offence committed by the law of the particular jurisdiction, then the person, if the person's still alive, obviously, then they should be made accountable in court. What actually happens to them, a terrible word, disposal, that's the next stage. And that's for a court to decide whether, in fact, but it's the getting somebody into court so that the victims can see that the state is taking it seriously and is not trying to shove it out the back door by saying, actually, we're not going to bother with them and we're having a cut-off at a certain level. And I think once you get that, then you can say to people, you know, hug each other. You can try before, but it's very difficult. It takes a long time. And in the Middle East, I've been sitting on the Russell Tribunal for, well, 5, nearly 6 years. I know it's deep-seated, and obviously I realize asking that, just like that, you can't. And what we were trying to do is the first stage, getting people to talk, listen, establish offences against international law, and so on. So the processes are there. I'm not saying the law has all the answers. I'm just saying there are mechanisms, and we should be employing them.
Well, I have to say, I like what Michael had to say about sequencing, because too often we think of dealing with the past coming out of, like, for example, the Colombian peace agreement, or even Northern Ireland. We think of it in very sort of legal, constitutional, very process-driven forms, when what we're dealing with is people killing people.
Yeah.
We're not dealing with somebody going through a red light or failing to build a building appropriately, and they're suing. We're dealing with profound human trauma and people killing people. And we tend to look at it in a very sort of abstract way. And I think these comments reaffirm we're complex beings, but we're actually very simple on one fundamental basis. We need to feel safe in the world. And one of the ways to feel safe is to be seen as you see yourself. And I think in terms of sequencing, I think we often talk about promoting empathy, reconciliation, and accountability. I think the first sequence is to be understood, to be seen. The challenge, and Northern Ireland is a perfect example, and I've written about it and talked about it there, is that, you know, the Truth Commission in South Africa, which my nonprofit had a role in bringing there in the early 90s, was based on the Chilean and Argentine models. And the South Africans said, okay, we had a dictatorship called apartheid, but we also had a leader, Nelson Mandela, and we wanted to promote reconciliation as well as accountability. But it's like the world has gone completely intellectually lazy, because in the last 21 years, the South African model has become the go-to model. And it's like trying to, in my view, put a floppy disk into an iPhone. In Northern Ireland, you know, my friends in Sinn Féin, I said, listen, you know, the United Kingdom is not a dictatorship. It's a liberal democracy, and the security services did some horrible things, but the vast majority of crimes were civilian on civilian. And if you're Catholic or Irish, you think this goes back 8 centuries. If you're Protestant, you think it's an aggravated crime wave of the last 30 or 40 years. And so the question is, whose truth is being told in a deeply divided community? And if there's any truth to be told, is that there are multiple truths. Well, how do you structure that? There's no sort of go-to mechanism out there to say, okay, how do you structure multiple narratives and multiple truths which are real to people in a way that doesn't exacerbate the tensions? And this is one of the challenges we have, but it's one of the necessary challenges, because they decided in Northern Ireland, there was even a church group and others who said, we can't have a truth commission because we have multiple truths that are legitimate for different communities. And I just want to say one thing, that this issue of, talk about forgiveness, I think in Rwanda, President Kagame, everybody sort of celebrated what they call the Gacaca system, a community-based sort of reconciliation process. Well, there are a lot of people in Rwanda who are victims who feel re-traumatized because their perpetrators, they're sort of almost being forced to embrace their perpetrators. And there's something profound about individuals deciding for themselves if they want to forgive. And I'll just give you a quick example of a woman from Kenya who now lives in Cambridge, outside of Boston. She was, long story short, she's Kenyan, she was a Catholic nun, and she was in charge of all girls' education in the country. Over 20 years ago, she was arrested, put in prison, tortured every day for 3.5 years, never allowed outside the prison. The gardener took pity for her and created the conditions for her to escape. She said she crawled out. She hadn't stood for 3.5 years, so she, with her own adrenaline, crawled to the side of the road. And 2 white South African doctors were going on a safari. They stop, they see this woman. They literally thought it was an animal. They got out with their flashlight to see what this was. They noticed it's a human being. She ends up recovering and sort of quietly slipped out, and she came to Harvard University. 6 years later, she's back in Kenya, and she decides to go to where that prison was. And she's standing at a street corner, and as she's about to cross the street, she looks up and she sees her chief torturer in his military uniform about to cross the street with his wife. And at that point, she freezes. And she said, I decided not only to continue to walk, I walked towards him and then I embraced him. And I said, I forgive you. And he all of a sudden started shaking and fell to the ground and started crying. And she said, his wife had no clue what this man had done to me or anybody else. And the wife was saying, who are you? What is this all about? And she said, for me, and it was my choice, the only way I can reconstruct my humanity was to understand how other human beings could do that. And the only way to re-empower my humanity and myself is to make my own choice. And my choice was to understand why another human being could do that and to forgive him. Nobody forced me to do it. I wanted to do it. And that's a difficult, difficult thing for people to do. But she decided to do that. And this is a woman I've never seen as liberated as anybody in her life, or anybody's life. And it was a powerful testament. And she says, forgiveness is a choice, but understanding is a responsibility. People need to understand why people do what they do.
That's incredibly moving.
That reminds me a bit of a doctor that I got to know who lives in Gaza, or lived in Gaza, and a specialist in IVF, and he was one of the very few people that could cross over from Erez into Israel, and he worked in the Beersheba hospital there. And a lot of his Israeli patients had no idea that this was a Palestinian doctor. But anyway, he was just at a time when society was pulling apart more and more. He was one of the very few bridge builders. That I met him first in 2001. In 2009, when Israel launched the war on Gaza, 3 of his daughters and his niece were killed by a tank shell that ripped through their bedroom wall. And it was really awful, because I'd spoken to him a few days before, and he told me that he was very worried about all the military activity around the house. But, you know, he wanted to be there. He taught at the university. He had patients. He ended up writing this book called I Shall Not Hate. And he very much took the decision that it was up to him how to lead the rest of his life, and he didn't want to give it over to hatred, because he felt that would be a victory for the people who robbed him of his daughters and his niece. So a lot of people didn't understand this point of view at all, but I think that he showed amazing emotional resilience, and he fully understood the society. He spoke fluent Israeli, Hebrew, so he was a commentator for Channel 10 on Israel TV, and he had lots of friends there. He knew a lot about the way that the army works, and he decided that this was the way to liberate him. But I know a lot of people would make very different decisions in his shoes.
Michael, on that point, the point that Lucy and Tim make about the choice for reconciliation, you can put in procedures for accountability very clearly, and Britain famously has failed to do that, as you have briefly illustrated on a number of fronts. Those are sort of structural, legal. You can do it, and if you don't do it, it's by choice. You're not doing it. How is there a legislative framework for reconciliation?
Well, there isn't a legislative framework for that. I mean, in another arena, you know, when it comes to matrimonial affairs, the government's tried to say you'll only get some form of financial assistance if you go to arbitration first. So, you know, they understand that concept in that particular field, but that's with one hand and taking away all the funding with the other hand. But that's the only bit of legislation. I think when it comes to these kind of issues, that, you know, ideas have dried up. In other words, the system is not dealing with it beyond actually the idea that you might, in the end, prosecute the right people. But of course, that's sometimes a forlorn hope, and that's been a sort of the path I've trodden over many, many years, watching the fact that it's fallen by the wayside, and getting the authorities to do the job properly and responsibly has been our task. But I think, I mean, all of these comments, I mean, I know the case about the doctor, because in fact, the foreign minister, Israeli minister, was being interviewed by the doctor's friend. Yeah. And it's all on television. You can see it on YouTube. It's live on air. It is absolutely remarkable. And the presenter leaves the studio, leaves the foreign minister to go to he can't get across the border. They won't let him in. And when the doctor goes back to the hospital the next day or the day after, where he's been working in Israel, they wouldn't let the survivors back into Israel. He was booed by Israeli doctors. And so you raise his case there, and which I have done, and they absolutely think you immediately that you're anti-Semitic. That's what happens. So I'm used to that kind of hatred that's really so inbred that you have to have extreme patience, and you can't actually, I don't think at the end of the day, legislate for it. But you can do it by example. Have I got time? 2 minutes. A Northern Irish example I've given several times, and I was really humbled to meet this person. I was doing Bloody Sunday at the time, and a solicitor said, would I come to Dublin and meet somebody? So he didn't tell me what it was about, and so I thought, well, it's probably high security. I don't know. We go to this restaurant, Italian restaurant, and a lot more happens, but I'm sitting with this man. I've been introduced to him, and he was introduced as Richard, not the second name. So, and halfway through the meal, I said, you know, a sort of thing, I think, oh my God, I'm saying it. Like you speak very loudly to somebody who you think's deaf, but they're not. I said, you can't, you're blind. He said, I'm absolutely intrigued that you didn't notice before. I said, you've ordered all your food, you've enjoyed it, you've described what you're eating, and I'm sitting here like a dumbo not knowing. And he said, no, that we didn't want you to know because we want you to listen to, and I said, fine, far away. So once he described his blindness, he was blinded by a rubber bullet in 1972. Well, 71, the end of 71, after internment. And he said, at that moment, there are people like this, like the Railwayman and all that film, you may have seen it. This individual said, I wanted to dedicate my life to reconciliation. So I go into schools and I say, I'm blinded. And he goes into Protestant schools because there's still a failure to integrate schools. So education is very important in this. You can't legislate for education. Well, you should be. There should be integrated schools. I was saying this only 2 weekends ago. That's where it starts. He goes into Protestant schools and he says, look, if you want more of this, you stay as you are, bigoted. But he doesn't put it like that. But what he's done much better, he set up a scheme in Africa. He's raised money, penny by penny by penny, through a radio program he runs. He calls himself, it's not his real name, Seymour. He's a brilliant musician. He raises the money. He set up water schemes in now the whole of Africa. And what he does is, every year he takes children, well, those under 18, young people, 10 Protestants, 10 Catholics. He takes them and he says, look, this is what you have to do Look at the world, as the last speaker was about, look at the world outside. And suddenly these children come and they, oh God, they haven't got water. Now we've given them water. They talk to each other, and when they go home, they're friends. And when they go home, their parents don't know how to divide them anymore, because they can't. It's a very slow process. But it's people like the doctor and people like this individual, Richard Seymour, who's still continuing this work, but he doesn't want to be identified publicly because he said, if I get any kind of, patronage or subsidy or whatever, that's the end of it. I want to do it privately and quietly and just get on with the job.
Before we briefly take questions, I just want to ask each of the three panelists very briefly about this question, this word closure. Does it exist? Is it a chimera? If it does exist, how do you get to it? You see it in people's personal lives through personal traumas or unhappinesses, but on a bigger scale as well. Wherever you go, whether you're looking at Argentina, Chile, Brazil, the Balkans, whatever, you have societies that are supposed to have moved on, and of course they haven't. Any thoughts on closure?
In human terms, I don't think it really exists. I think you can get closer to it, which is to be more at peace and centered in oneself, and then through that in one's family and community. But I can tell you in the United States right now, we're doing our first initiative on issues of race and inclusion. And I'm learning as a native Bostonian who comes from an Irish Catholic background, that I don't know my city the way I thought I did. And I'm seeing the same dynamics around the world in my own city and my own country. And it relates to closure because, we ended slavery thanks to Abraham Lincoln and the American Civil War. So we may have ended or, and all the way to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, dealt with the external manifestations of slavery and race, or racism. But we know that's not sufficient. So there certainly wasn't closure there. Now we have to really deal with what I call the internal manifestations of racism and difference. And that is a big part of being seen and understood. But it's also a huge sort of cognitive emotional shift for people who have never been marginalized, because they literally can't put themselves into another person's experience on a daily basis. And yet, to be a victim, so on one hand, we can think of Black Lives Matter. Michael probably knows the great Albie Sachs from South Africa, who we brought to Boston 3 months ago. And we took him to the oldest school in the United States, Boston Latin School. It's a high school. Harvard was literally founded so graduates of this school could go to college. And huge racial tensions. And make a very long story short, there were these young African-American students, and they were talking about white privilege, institutions of racism, power, privilege. There were 2 or 3 other white students who were even more vociferous. And then there were about 20 or 30 other students, some Latino, mostly white, who were sympathetic, but you could see they were in some pain. Now, if you don't know Albie Sachs, he was one of the great leaders of the South African transition, lost an arm and an eye to a security attack by the South African security services. And as he's listening, he says to these girls at the end, for you to claim the status of victim is to claim a privilege. And so it's about closure. It doesn't happen.
If you both wouldn't mind holding your thought, because I'm getting the questions board coming at me, and we've only got 5 or 10 minutes, so if you weave your thoughts on that into answers to questions. Let's have a couple of questions before we, to coin a phrase, close. Here on the side.
Question for Michael. You were talking about when the time was right for things. I heard you on the radio a while ago talking about the historic Child Abuse Commission, where you said you'd be ready to serve on it. And they've got rid of 3 people, yet you are the most eminently person.
Louder, please.
You would be the best possible person to serve on it. Indeed, all the victims would like you to serve on it. Are they just simply kicking it into the long grass in not asking you to chair it?
Well, I won't be playing into their hands by conceding that it's all to do with me. No, I do think there is a force here, which is, it goes back to the point you were making, is that the British establishment over many, many decades, well, centuries really, when it comes to dealing with horny questions of this kind that they've had for a long, long time, they just put them on the back burner if they can find a way. I mean, my goodness, they've gone all the way to New Zealand to avoid asking me. So, but they're back in the same, it seems to me, back in the same problem, namely that they've found somebody on the panel who's not a lawyer, so quite how she's going to decide all the questions of law, which are piling up outside the front door. And secondly, in terms of some of the victims, they're saying, but wait a minute, she comes from the very profession which has caused the problem in the first place. So we don't actually want a member of the profession chairing it. So I think they're going to run into the ground again. But on the other hand, there are serious questions about whether they really want to address it because it's so big. It's probably the biggest inquiry into, I'm going to put it generally, collusion and corruption that the United Kingdom has seen. And they really don't want to face it, or they want to put it off to the next government and the government after. So yeah, I think there's a lot of that in it, and they know that I would be asking some pretty tetchy and difficult questions. But I think just one, you said I'll include it in the answer, just to say something about Tim's thing. I disagree. I think there can be closure. I'll give you one example. In terms of Bloody Sunday, I represented a number of families. Now, they ended by being satisfied with the inquiry, but some wanted to move forward towards the possibility of prosecution, and that's been considered about 6 months ago, in fact. But there were another group of families who were, and one of them actually fainted during my cross-examination because we achieved something she never expected. She said, that's it.
Right.
She was carried out on a stretcher, closed, finished.
Let's do two questions at this, straight after the other and answer them, and then we'll have to wrap. Yep, thank you.
Sure.
Yep, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, I worked 5 years with survivors of genocide in Kurdistan, Iraq, and there were a number of things that came up regularly. One of them was closure, of course, because they want their victims to be uncovered from mass graves so that they could bury them, because they keep hoping that one day somebody's helped them and they've escaped and they have memory loss and they will come back. So closure doesn't happen if you don't have a body to bury. That's very important. The second thing is reparations and compensation for these families who've lost not just members, but also their livelihood, their lives, their way of life. That also doesn't happen. And many of them laugh when you talk to them about forgiveness. And they say, we're not God. You know, what is forgiveness? You know, I am only human. I've lost everything. How could I forgive? And there isn't even a conversation about truth and reconciliation. Some of them just want to know exactly what happened to my family member before I can even think about forgiving you. So, I mean, the examples you gave are excellent, but I'm sure there are also exceptions, because even though, on the other hand, when Saddam Hussein was hanged, and many of the women were saying, I want Saddam Hussein to be hanged right in front of my house so I can watch it. When he was hanged, and I re-interviewed some of the women, and they were saying, well, I don't feel any better. But still, there is this process that has to be go through, and it includes many things and not just, you know, I think it's closure, compensation, conversation, truth and reconciliation, and maybe forgiveness at some stage.
Thank you. Gentleman there.
Right at the beginning, Tim mentioned that the human animal was an emotionally rational entity and therefore governed by its emotions. But it's not clear that the processes that have been discussed thereafter really go back to address it. You said that there has to be a fundamental review, a paradigm shift in how this whole thing is addressed, presumably from the perspective that you have to deal with recognition of the emotional rather than, it's not, we can think about this, et cetera, and that's pretty fundamental.
We've got probably time for one more quick question if anybody has one, or let's confine it right here in the front row, and then we'll quickly final remarks and answering those 3 points from our panelists.
What role do you feel that civic leaders could and should play in actually putting these issues before young people in order to turn the switch, as it were, on the next generation?
Okay, so we've got next generation, we've got the question of how do you can you achieve the paradigm shift, and the lady talking about Kurdistan, and you've got to do the basics first, economic livelihood, find out what happened, recover bodies, etc. Lucy?
Just talking about what you were saying, I think sometimes you also need closure for the perpetrators, because in this theatre project I was talking about in Colombia, there was one young woman from the paramilitaries, and no one was interested in her story. She saw how a whole lot of bodies were being set on fire just so that they couldn't be traced. And she managed to salvage some of them and put them in plastic bags. And she'd been trying to tell the authorities, look, there are these people here, their families should find out, they need to know, what happened to them. And she said that time and again she was told that they had so many of these mass graves all over the country that they just hadn't got time to look into them all. But she was tortured by it, because in her way of thinking, she was never going to be able to come to terms with what she'd been made to do until some sort of, she just felt this was the one thing that she could offer in some sort of way of saying sorry for what she'd done. So I think that is immensely important, and that also I agree with you that all these practical considerations are hugely important as well. I mean, you need some form of income, you need land to go back to, you need some way of surviving.
We also have the whole recovery question on natural disasters, as you do on man-made crimes and war crimes and wars as well. That sense of recovery and also you can be let down just as easily on those issues as anything else. Michael.
Yeah, just a quickie to answer the emotional question. Because in fact, the system in the UK finally has woken up to that need. And Hillsborough actually is the first one in which it's happened. I mention it now, I wasn't going to talk in detail about it, but I think it's such an important question of what's been recognized by the system at long last, that in the case of inquests, which are of course a particular animal for the UK jurisdiction, but never mind, you'll get the idea of it, that instead of the families, as they often do at inquests, sitting at the side and not participating, that's all changed through the European Convention. So before people start talking about a British Bill of Rights, one has to remember what's been achieved through the European Convention. Families are now at the centre of inquests, and what the coroner did on this occasion, the first, I think, 4 to 6 weeks of the inquests into the 96 deaths was allocated to every one of the 96 families who would have their day in court. They were given time to talk directly to the jury about who they were, and photographs of their loved ones and what it's meant, the impact. It's never happened in that way before. So the emotional need, which they all felt, great relief at the end of these 4 to 6 weeks, but horrific for the listeners to watch each family tell their story. So when the jury came to consider, they remembered what it meant. So it's your point.
But you have victim impact reports now on regular criminal trials.
You do have that, but that comes at the end. The point about this is it came at the beginning and it forms part of the process towards the final narrative. Somebody's saying finish. Yes. I'm going to finish.
Yeah. Right. Yes. Right.
And as the eminent Michael said earlier, I take back the point, we can achieve closure. And because you just reminded me of a couple of cases that were clear. And to your point, I think the reason I said we can't, because there are more examples where it's not achieved. Yeah. But Pinochet, I have to thank Margaret Thatcher for 2 things. And I know this is a cognitive dissonance comment. It's like saying trumping Trump. And that is that, when Margaret Thatcher sent the British Navy to reclaim the Falklands, it led to the collapse of the Argentine generals and the dictatorship. So even though she was no longer prime minister, Pinochet thought as long as his good friend Margaret Thatcher was still in London, he could go off and get medical care in London. And it turns out he got arrested, imprisoned, and was so humiliated that when he was sent back to Chile, it had a massive psychological impact on the country in a positive way. Because for the first time, people felt liberated to bring these generals and other people to prison. And I think what was profound about that was often people get closure, and there is a real need for bodies of people who have been killed or missing. But there's also to see the person who represented power stripped of that authority and agency. And when that is done, it has a huge psychological impact on people in a positive way as individuals and communities, because they no longer feel, many of them, that what threatened them will come back. And I think that's when closure can happen. But I do think, to the paradigm shift, that we really need to recognize, what shapes human behavior, and then go from there.
And on a positive note, and we haven't even discussed the International Criminal Court, which for all its faults, we saw a fabulous sense of accountability last week for cultural destruction. So there are mechanisms that are a sign of improvement. Right, enough from us. We've had the finish line. We've had Mark going like this for the last several moments.
This is about closure, Mark.
So please thank Lucy, Tim, and Michael for the show.